Well, as you know, we are going to continue our time of studying in the book of James this week. We're still in James chapter 1. I'm going to cover a few more verses this morning. When I told Dawn what verses we were going to study together, she said, "Oh." That's what she said, "Oh." She thought maybe it was going to be too many and it was going to be too long, but hopefully that won't be the case. We're going to begin this morning with, as we did last week, we're going to read all of the 18 verses together, 1 through 18, and then we're going to proceed to dig into those verses 12 through 18 together as we consider that we find blessings in our trials. Blessings in our trials. Would you begin with me as we begin in verse chapter 1? James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Now we come to the verses 2 through 5 where he talks about joy in trials, which was a couple of weeks ago. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And now we come to the verses 6 through 8, where we see wisdom in trials. And he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. And then last week we talked about this section, perspective in trials, verses 9 through 11. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat, and withers the grass, and its flowers fall, and its beauty perishes. So also will a rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. And what we noticed there as well is that it is not merely the rich man that will fade away in his pursuits, but it is also the poor man that will fade away. And it's not that, it's obviously making a different point about the riches themselves will fade away, but we saw that both, poverty and riches are both temporary. And so that is how we find perspective in our trials. And the next section is verses 12 through 18, so it's a total of 7 verses. If you include both 12 and 18, that makes 7. I know 18 minus 12 is 6, but anyway. We see blessings in trials, blessings in trials. And he begins here, or continues here, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. And so I don't know if you find this, but as I read these verses, it's not always as clear to me what James is saying. He says a lot of different things, and so the dots, I think, are connected loosely. You remember when we would do dot to dots as kids, or maybe you would give dot to dots to your kids, and sometimes you would be able to see the dots were just close enough together. You could see the figure that was going to be created if you connected those dots. You could just see it right there without even connecting the dots. The dots themselves made it obvious. But other dot to dots, either there weren't as many dots, so they were scattered apart, or the dots weren't contiguous. They would go over here and then back over here, and you couldn't look at the dots and figure out what it was going to be until you connected the dots. And I think that's more what we see with James. There's dots, but they're like either all over the place, or they seem to be disconnected. But I think that we have to look at this passage, and as I've said before, and I said during Sunday school, we have to consider that James had a train of thought here. He wasn't just saying different things all over the map for the sake of saying those things. He had a train of thought, and these things should be viewed as connected, even if sometimes a bit loosely. And so it may be difficult for us to follow this full train of thought. But as we begin this in verse 12 here, we see, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial." Now, does anyone have trouble connecting that dot? I think that is like the statement that gives us the full idea of what he's going to be talking about, even though if you read through these verses in isolation, if you look at the phrases that is coming up that we just read, in isolation, it's kind of hard for us to understand what he's actually saying, but I think this actually says it very clearly. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. This is a return to the original premise that he gave up in verse 2 when he first began the book. "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." And he goes on, "For you know that the testing of your faith produces" what? Steadfastness. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast. So that dot connects. Blessed and joy and steadfastness and steadfast and trial. Count it all joy when you meet various kinds of trials. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Not just have you achieved a steadfastness, but you remain steadfast. This is like you're going to endure. You're going to stay on course. You're not going to allow these things to knock you off course. You may get knocked, but you're steadfast. You're going to stay on course. You're going to complete the mission that you've been given. Remaining steadfast, I want you to see, is not something that's automatic or guaranteed. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast. It's not guaranteed. We can remain steadfast or we don't have to. But he's saying if you do remain steadfast, you're blessed. You're blessed. But also, I want you to see that he says under trial. You know, we will encounter trials. You could reverse those and say, blessed is the man who, having encountered trials and continue to encounter trials, remains steadfastness. Remain steadfast, See, the blessed part is dependent on our response to the trial, whether or not we remain steadfast. And so, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, in other words, we have this trial, and the trial is doing something. It is testing us. This This is a different Greek word. It's related, but it's a different Greek word from the trial. The trial is testing us. It's testing how we will respond. It's testing, what we will do. We encounter something, and do we panic? Do we just cry? I'm not saying crying is never, warranted, but is our response just to break down? Is our response to give up? Is our response to just go find some, friend, or, we're not at this stage in life, but, run to mommy, run to daddy? Is that our response? Obviously, we want to run to God, but that's not what I'm saying. But, are we going to face the trial? What is our response? I want us to realize that we don't know how we're going to respond to the test before the test comes. But God knows. He knows what test we're going to face, and He knows how we're going to respond. But we don't know that. We may think we know. But you may run up against some difficulty in life, and beforehand you say, well, if this ever happens to me, I'm going to do such and such. But it doesn't always work that way. We don't really know how we're going to respond until we face those pressures, that difficulty. We may think that we're going to be strong, or that we're going to be wise, or whatever it is, but we may not know that. We don't know that until we actually encounter those things. And so this idea of testing actually exposes to us how we will respond. Gives us the opportunity to demonstrate, I said I trusted God, and when this trial came, I actually did trust Him. Or maybe I didn't trust Him, and I said I was going to, I said I trusted Him, and this trial came, and it exposed a weakness. And there's a role for exposing those weaknesses. Sometimes if you expose the weakness, what it means is that something needs to be fixed. Something needs to be repaired. Something needs to be strengthened. And so when we fail the test, so to speak, it still gives us the opportunity to make a change, to say, okay, I'm going to actually trust God. I'm going to pray and ask Him for help to trust Him. Lord, I believe, but help thou my unbelief, as the man whose child was sick said to Jesus. So we encounter these trials, and one of the results is we find out how we're going to respond. But there's another result of the trials, and this is given the idea of developmental testing. This is we are strengthened through the trial itself. We grow through having been tested. Fred mentioned this morning that they're in the springtime they start planting their tomato plants, the seeds inside, and as they start to grow, they want those tomato plants to be strong, and so they put a fan there to blow it, and as it blows it, it causes the plant to be stronger, not only in the root system, but even the stem. It becomes stronger. It responds to this, and that may not be much of a test. It's a little bit of a fan. It's a little bit of wind, but it causes it to develop further and to be stronger. And that is one of the things that happens in testing. We find out how it is we're going to respond. We find out whether we actually trust Him or not, but it also helps us be strengthened so that we, even if we respond well, how do we get strengthened when we respond correctly, when we trust Him in a test? Well, it reinforces the idea that He's trustworthy. We said we would trust Him. This difficulty came along. various kinds. It could be health, could be financial, could be, who knows what, could be all sorts of different things. And when that test came along and we trusted him and he was faithful to us, not that everything became hunky-dory, no, but we recognized that even though things were difficult, he loves us and took care of us through that, then that strengthens us, that reinforces that trust, so that next time around, we can count our blessings. And we can look back and say, well, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, this happened, and God took care of me. Look, I thought life was over. I thought I was going to die. No, God took care of me. And, 15 years ago or 10 years ago, 5 years ago, all of these different times through my life, I've encountered these things, different kinds of things, and I see that God took care of me. And all of those things tend to reinforce this idea that God is trustworthy. And so that strengthens our resolve to trust him when those things come the next time. And guess what? There will be a next time. If he spares our life and we live, there will be a next time. We will encounter another trial. And so, for when he has stood the test, that was kind of the middle of a sentence, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Now, the crowns are kind of an interesting topic that we see throughout Scripture, kind of scattered throughout Scripture, this reference to crowns, and we think of them as rewards, and in a sense they are rewards, but they're not the kind of thing where we get to heaven and he gives us our rewards and we take our rewards and look at me, I've got these rewards. No, we wouldn't be very humble if that were the case. That's not what it's about. What do we do with those crowns when we're in glory? We cast them at Jesus' feet. They are really a testament to his faithfulness. This crown of life, this trusting him and seeing him faithful, is a testament to his faithfulness. It's not really a testament to our trusting him. It's a testament to his faithfulness. And we read of the crown of life in Revelation chapter 2, when John records, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer." Notice the word suffer there links to the idea of trials that James is talking about here. So there's this continuity between the two. Crown of life has to do with suffering or enduring trials. Do not fear when you are about to suffer. Behold, now get this, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. So who's in control here? Is God in control or is the devil in control? Well, I would have to take us back to the book of Job to consider what the sequence of events were. God said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" He held Job up as an example and said, "Have you considered my servant Job? He trusts, he's faithful, he loves me." And then Satan proceeded to say, "Well, that's only because you're not allowing him to be tested. If he was tested, then he would obviously reject you." And so God allowed Satan to test Job. And it went so far as Satan went back again before the Lord and said, "Well, you're not allowing me to actually touch him. Yes, you allowed me to take his family, but you didn't allow me to touch him himself." And God said, you can touch him, just don't take his life. So God actually gave Satan that permission, and Satan actually brought to Job these physical infirmities, the boils, and so on. And Job endured. He trusted God. And so here we read, behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. So we see that God is allowing Satan to do something, and God has a purpose for it, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. So for a period of time you'll have tribulation. Now notice what he says. Be faithful unto death. Be faithful unto death. Don't just wait the 10 days and say, okay, the 10 days is going to be over and the tribulation's going to go away and I'm going to be fine. No, be faithful unto death. Trust him even if this tribulation, this trial endures and goes on and persists and you don't find relief in this life. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Some of our trials are very obviously temporary trials. We talked a little bit during Sunday school hour, and we talked about the fact that in some cases, you may lose your job. You may have a financial difficulty, and that is typically a temporary trial. You'll find another job. It may not make as much money. You may have to make different choices in life in order to make ends meet, but there's still provision. There's still, it's a short-term trial. Not all trials are short-term like that. Not all trials go away. There are health trials, some of which are permanent. I say permanent as long as this life lasts. I'm not necessarily talking about fatal conditions where the condition itself leads to death. That is the case, but there's also those conditions that are ongoing. I'm sorry, I left my vocabulary at home this morning, but you're familiar with the kind of condition that I'm talking about. If you remember it, you can help me out. But conditions that are not fatal, but they're permanent. They're going to continue. Cannot remember the word, but anyway, please forgive me. This too shall pass. We have these testings that will persist this whole life. Paul told us about a test that he endured, and he asked the Lord to take it away multiple times. He wasn't dying from it, but it was a thorn in the flesh, he called it. It was apparently a physical condition of some sort, he said, in the flesh, and we believe that it was probably his eyesight, and he couldn't see, couldn't read very well. And this would have been tormenting to Paul, who loved the scriptures and he loved to study the scriptures and learn them and relearn them, reread them. If he had trouble seeing well enough to read, he even says in one particular book, a letter that he wrote, normally he would dictate his letters and someone else would write them down, but in one particular place he says, "See how large a letter I write." In other words, you can tell by the handwriting that this is me writing this, because I want you to know that I love you. I am praying for you. I care about you. See the handwriting. And so it was large. This afflicted him. We have such health concerns among our congregation here. And we need to remain faithful in spite of those things that will persist, and we will endure until death. And other types of things, there may be trials, there may be terminal conditions that the death is a result of that condition. And we need to remain faithful unto death. And then there are those trials that come in the form of persecutions. And we know that there, historically in the church, there have been those who have been willing to die for their faith. We see that in the book of Acts. We see Stephen died for his faith. We see the apostle James died for his faith. And we see history tells us of the deaths of most of the apostles. We know that John apparently did not die for his faith. God preserved his life so that he could write the book of Revelation, I believe. But he wants us to withstand. He wants us to remain faithful in the testing. Remain faithful until death. And we will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Notice that we say we love him, but a demonstration of our loving him is remaining faithful unto death, whatever that means for us. He goes on then, and he kind of turns a corner, and this is one of these things, well, the dot was here, and now the dot's way over here on the paper. It says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. I am being tempted by God. And how does that fit in with this? Well, we're going to be faithful, and we're not going to blame God for these difficulties. And I just want to point out here that he once again, this is the same word technically as trial, but it's used in a different way. This is the response to the trial. We're being tested, and how are we going to respond to the trial? Are we going to respond in temptation? Are we going to be tempted because of the trial itself? You know, we have a tendency, the world has a tendency. In fact, maybe you faced this question yourself, or maybe yourself, you've actually questioned this. Why, God? Maybe you know someone, a loved one, a friend or loved one who has encountered some difficulty in life, and they ask that question, why, God? And I'm not saying I don't believe that that's a bad question to ask. It kind of depends on why you're asking it. But if you allow yourself to ask that question in essentially an accusatory way, what you're doing is you're blaming God. You're saying, God, you did this to me. You're tempting me. I mean, we know that God allows, and I would even go so far as to say he orchestrates trials, tests. But temptation is not what God is doing. He's allowing something, he's orchestrating something to test us, to prove us, to strengthen us. His purpose is not to tempt us. We talked about this during Sunday school. He's purifying us. He has an intent that he's doing through these trials, and it is not to tempt us. See, we can respond to trials in different ways, and one of those ways is to be tempted to sin. We'll get to this momentarily, but this is not what God is doing. He's not tempting us to sin. James writes, "For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one." I find this very interesting. It's like a reversal. James' argument is not just that God can't tempt people to sin. No, he starts out and he says God cannot be tempted. That's the reversal of the question. And his point is that God is sin is the antithesis of God. He's the definition of holiness. You know, sin, we read in Romans 3:23, is falling short. In fact, that word sin is an archery term. And it literally means, you know, you're shooting for a target and the arrow falls short of the target. It's a sin. And you'll hear this in sports today even. Where someone misses something, it's called a sin. We missed the mark. We're falling short of God's glory, His holiness, His perfection. He is the very definition of holiness. Sin literally is defined as not measuring up, as missing the mark. Therefore, God can't be tempted to sin. To say that God can be tempted to sin is saying you're tempting God not to be Himself. What does that mean? Tempting God not to be Himself. He's the definition of holiness. To tempt God is to ask Him not to be Himself. His character is holiness. That's one of His character traits. He can't be tempted with evil because He's the definition of holiness. Evil itself defies His very nature. He in nature, in essence, is holy. You can't tempt Him with sin. So where does temptation come from? Well, James says, he goes on, he says, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Temptation doesn't come from God. It comes from us. It comes from our desires. Now, of course, if you read this verse in isolation, you're going to get the idea that of like lurid temptation, desires for forbidden things. And I think that that's true. James isn't saying that's not true, but in the train of thinking, he's not necessarily talking about those things, about, say, sexual sins or sensual sins. He's talking about desires in general. And in the scope of trials, we have desires. We want things to be a certain way. We want to have provision when we are encountering a financial trial. We want our health to be restored. We want, when someone has wronged us, and that can be a trial of sorts, we want vengeance. We want things to be the way we want them. We have these desires. Certainly, it does extend into other things that are not necessarily related to trials. Our desires are always the thing that leads us into sin, that tempts us, if you will. We want to be relevant in the world. We want popularity. We want fame. We want riches. We want all of these things. We want vengeance. Our own desires are those things that we want. They become bait. It's actually the picture of what James is painting here, lured and enticed. It's like, you catch a fish, you put something that the fish wants on the hook. A worm that wriggles. It calls the fish's name. Or you catch a shark by putting, blood. So usually you cut up a fish and you put that on a big hook. I don't even know if you call it a hook. But anyway, you can catch a shark. Something the shark wants. You lure it, but there's a hook. In the same way, our desires, whatever they are, they entice us. They lure us to make certain decisions. See, we're presented with a trial, and the question is, how are we going to respond? And our desires lure us to respond a certain way. And the question is, are we going to give in to our desires or not? But the very fact that we are even entertaining something because of our desires, we are tempting ourselves. We're tempting ourselves. Our own desire tempts us to sin. James goes on, then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. That word conceived. It's interesting, he uses this analogy of birth. And so we have this picture of conception. It's the very beginning. It's when you first consider the possibility that you could seek that. That is where the temptation begins. Just imagining, just thinking about it, just what do I want? And just imagining I could pursue that. That is the beginning of the temptation. Gives birth to sin. If we don't stop that thinking about that, what we want, we will sin. And so at that point, what we've already done is we've put our desire above our love for God. We're not going to God at that time and asking God for his help through this trial. I believe, but help thou my unbelief. We're not doing that. No, we're thinking about what we want. We're not going to God. We're putting something above our love for God. We're breaking the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. We've already broken the commandment. In essence, we've already sinned. And as we continue down that path, we're gonna basically sin more. And he says, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. There's a result of sin. And I've got a whole bunch of verses here written down that reference this idea. For the wages of sin is death. What we earn when we sin is death. The free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord, Romans 6:23. Romans 8:13, if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Romans 5:12, therefore just as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. Sin leads to death. Ezekiel 18:20, the soul who sins shall die. Genesis 2:17, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it you shall surely die. Proverbs 11:19, whoever is steadfast in righteousness will live, but he who pursues evil will die. James 5:20, which that's where we're at right now. Oh, no, we're not. That's the end of James. I'm sorry. Let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. That's kind of the reverse. You can be saved, but what are you saved from? You're saved from death. Hebrews 10:26 and 27. If we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. And Numbers 18:22, so that the people of Israel do not come near the tent of meeting, lest they bear sin and die. Remember, that was when Moses was at the tent of meeting with God, and the Israelites were instructed to stay back. Why? Because if they were found with sin, and let me ask you something, were they found with sin? They were found with sin. They would die. Sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. We're going to encounter trials. The question is how you respond. If you're steadfast, responding in trust in God, then you'll receive the crown of life. Don't blame God for tempting you to sin. If you're tempted to sin, it's your own desires that are leading you into that temptation. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers, he says. This is clearly a source of missing the truth, of deceiving ourselves, really, of not understanding. That's why James is spending this time on this. Trials are going to come into our lives. It is not God trying to tempt us to sin. It is God trying to bring something, what does it say? Something good. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. In the flow of this passage, what is the gift? What is the good and perfect gift? It is the trial and what the trial is supposed to produce. We should consider ourselves, we should count it joy. We should realize that we are blessed if we remain steadfast. Every good and perfect gift comes from above, down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. God's not going to change. If he was ever good, he's going to remain good. We're not going to be tempted by God to sin. That's not going to happen. It can't happen. By his very character, he can't do that. But he never changes. Malachi 3:6, I, the Lord, do not change. Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ the same, yesterday, today, and forever. This comes back to, if we know his character traits, if we know who he is, who he claims to be, he's both eternal and unchanging. And if we trust those things, then we're not going to be lured down the path of thinking he's tempting us, blaming it on him. No, it's our desires that are tempting ourselves. And then James closes this section with a very simple truth. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. He brought us forth by the word of truth. And there's two, and I think he's referring to both things here. One is he created us by his word. And secondly, he saved us by the gospel, his word of truth. He decided to do that. It was his own will that he did that. He created us and he saved us. And why? That we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation. Not just that we would, be in glory with him. He created us to be with him, that's true. But he also saved us, He created us to be with him, and he saved us to be restored to him, to be sanctified, to be holy. This is an integral part of why he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures, that we should be made holy. All of creation one day will be renewed, restored. But it really started with Jesus going to the cross for us so that we could live in that way. You know, there's some maybe confusing things if you're not careful, where you think, okay, I'm a Christian, and if I sin, then I'll die. But I don't think that James is saying, I mean, that can be true. There's a sin that leads to death, John says in his letter. But I don't think this is like the idea of eternal death in hell. If we're saved. But I think in presenting this passage, James is he's not saying, I know you're saved. No, he's saying you claim to be. You claim to trust in God. Now let's see. How are you responding to trials? If you are consistently allowing yourself to be tempted, allowing your desire to lead you astray, then maybe there's not really a salvation there to begin with. And maybe there's an examining of one's heart that needs to happen. See, James in this passage presents blessings and curses, life and death. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Just like Moses presented to Israel, the children of Israel, blessings and curses, life and death. He said, by your choices, choose to obey, choose right, and you'll live. And if you don't choose right, then you'll die. This isn't making our salvation dependent on our choices. This is saying, if you trust in him, then you will obey him. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. This is a response, a result of being accepting his grace and being saved. We have the opportunity to respond in the context of trials. We have the opportunity to respond in wisdom to God, or we have the opportunity to respond in temptation by allowing our desires to govern our choices, our words, and ultimately in whom we trust. The result of those choices is to either choose the blessing that comes with that maturity, that steadfastness, or to choose death, to choose sin and leading to death. If we truly know him and trust him for our salvation, then when we are presented with these trials, then we should be demonstrating our trust in him by enduring and by remaining steadfast. And if we find that we don't remain faithful and steadfast in those times of trial and difficulty, then we'll find ourselves, our desires tempting us, and we'll sin, and then we need to search our hearts and determine, do we actually trust in him or do we not? Do we actually trust in him for our salvation, which is ultimately what is at issue? If we trust in him for our salvation, then we should, I almost want to say we will, trust in him for all of these other things. How much more will your Father which is in heaven give you good gifts? Every good and perfect gift comes from above, from the Father of lights. Let's close in a word of prayer.